Ever wonder, what happens when you pack too many people into a limited space? Like, what are the consequences? Well, today we're diving into the world of population density.
Yeah, it's a fascinating and honestly sometimes kind of disturbing topic.
Right. And to help us really understand this, we're going to be looking at the work of John B. Calhoun.
Oh, absolutely. Calhoun was a researcher who did some really groundbreaking
Even
experiments
that.
with rats and mice back in the 40s through the 70s.
Yeah, so Calhoun, he created these things he called rodent utopias.
Yeah, he wanted to provide these creatures with like everything they needed to thrive.
Yeah, perfect little worlds.
Exactly.
But things did not go as planned.
No, they did not. In some of his early work, he built this quarter-acre enclosure for wild Norway rats.
Wow.
And I mean, they had everything: food, water, shelter, no predators, minimal disease. It was like a rat paradise.
Total rat paradise. Yeah, I mean, you'd think they would just explode in population, right?
You would think so. But the population stabilized at a surprisingly low 150 rats,
Whoa.
way below the 5,000 that they expected to see.
Huh. Why? What was happening?
Well, the infant mortality rate was super high.
Oh, wow.
And what Calhoun realized was that even in this like utopia, social stress was affecting the mothers. It was impacting survival rates like right from the start.
That's incredible. So it's like the pressure of just living in that limited space, even with unlimited resources, was having these unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And to really explore this further, Calhoun, he carried out these even more controlled experiments at the National Institute of Mental Health. He built these meticulously designed smaller universes for rats and mice. So picture like a 10 by 14-foot room divided into 4 pens. It was designed to comfortably hold 48 rats,
Right.
but it ended up housing 80.
Oh, wow. So he essentially built like these like rodent cities to try to isolate the pure impact of population density, like taking away any other external factors that
Yeah,
might affect growth.
exactly.
So what happened?
Well, he started observing these behavioral pathologies. So, like, many females couldn't carry their pregnancies to term or even successfully give birth. And the ones that did give birth, they often failed in their maternal duties. They would abandon their pups or scatter them throughout the pen.
Oh, man. That's heartbreaking to imagine those mothers just like unable to care for their offspring because of the stress of this environment. And what about the males?
Well, they exhibited their own spectrum of abnormal behaviors. Like, we saw everything from sexual deviance and even cannibalism all the way to frenetic overactivity and then, like, this pathological withdrawal.
It's amazing how that density can trigger such extreme behaviors.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the most shocking phenomenon that he observed, which is the so-called behavioral sink.
Yeah, in some of the experiments, the majority of the rats would just crowd into one specific pen
Really?
during feeding time. So you can imagine what kind of density that created in that one particular area.
Wow. So essentially eating, which is like this very basic biological need, became this like obsessive social activity,
Yeah.
which then just further reinforced the crowding behavior, right?
Exactly, like this pathological togetherness that disrupted all of these other essential behaviors. I mean, mating, nest building, caring for young, just general survival. In some experiments, the infant mortality rate was like a staggering 96%.
Oh my gosh. 96%. That's just, it's terrible. So did Calhoun try to like prevent this behavioral sink from forming in later experiments?
He did, yeah. In subsequent experiments, he modified the way he delivered the food.
Oh, how did he do that?
So instead of using pellets, he switched to powdered food, which sped up the eating process and just made it less conducive to crowding.
Oh, interesting. So he's like trying to break that cycle of crowding by tweaking the way they access resources. Did it work?
Well, the results were mixed. While powdered food did reduce crowding, the behavioral sink still emerged in some cases.
Hmm. Okay, so it wasn't as simple as just changing the way the rats were fed. There was something deeper going on.
Absolutely. So he also tried this specially designed drinking fountain
Oh, okay.
that promoted social drinking,
Oh, interesting.
where the rats had to press a lever to get the water.
Okay.
And interestingly enough,
Yeah.
this didn't lead to a behavioral sink like the food did.
Oh, that is interesting.
They would basically drink upon waking and then stay in their home pens,
Oh, okay.
which really reduced that excessive wandering and crowding.
Okay, so it seems like the type of resource
Right.
and the way they access it
Exactly.
really influence the behavior. But
Absolutely.
even without the behavioral sink, there were still tons of problems.
Oh, yeah.
So, like, what was going on with the females in these crowded conditions?
Well, in the more crowded middle pens, the females started to lose the ability to build proper nests.
Oh,
Instead of creating these like typical cup-shaped nests, they would just pile up materials or completely abandon nest building altogether.
wow.
And they would also abandon their pups, scatter them throughout the pen instead of keeping them together. It was like the stress just short-circuited their natural instincts.
It's really a sad image. And I
Yeah.
can't imagine the added pressure that these females were under during estrus.
Right, like the females in heat were relentlessly pursued by packs of males.
Oh, wow.
And there was no escape for them. The stress was immense, which led to really high mortality rates
Yeah.
from pregnancy and birthing complications.
Wow.
I mean, nearly half of the first and second generation females in these behavioral sync situations
Yeah.
died from these causes.
It's shocking how that lack of control and that constant pressure can impact survival. But what about in the end pens of the experiments where there was less density?
Yeah.
Was the situation any better there?
There was actually a stark contrast.
Okay.
So these less populated pens, which Calhoun called brood pens,
Okay.
had lower infant and female mortality rates.
Okay.
And these pens were usually dominated by a single male who would protect his, harem of females.
Yep.
And the females in these brood pens exhibited normal maternal behaviors and were way more successful in raising their young.
It seems like even within this artificial utopia,
Right.
some kind of social hierarchy emerged.
Yeah.
And the degree of crowding really influenced how that hierarchy
Yeah.
impacted individual well-being.
Right.
What about the males?
Right.
Did they have their own challenges as density increased?
They absolutely did.
Yeah.
So as the males matured, they would fight for dominance, and a clear hierarchy would develop.
Mhm.
But in the more crowded middle pens, that hierarchy was in constant flux,
Oh.
with frequent and violent power struggles.
Oh, wow.
So the dominant males were aggressive, yes,
Okay.
but they were also generally the most normal in their behavior towards the females and the pups.
So instability and violence was just like the norm
Pretty much.
in those denser pens.
Yeah.
So how did those lower-ranking males adapt
Right.
to this really stressful environment?
So in the crowded pens, those lower-ranking males developed these kind of fascinating and often disturbing ways of adapting.
Okay.
So, for example, there were these passive males.
Okay.
They were withdrawn, but they seemed physically healthy.
Okay.
The problem was they were totally socially disoriented. They didn't interact with others, and others didn't interact with them.
Oh, wow.
It's like they had mentally checked out.
So they were physically present,
Yeah.
but socially absent.
Right.
Like a very bleak form of existence.
Yeah, definitely.
And what about the other types of males that emerged? Didn't Calhoun also observe some hyperactive males in his experiments?
Yeah, he called them probers.
Sobers, okay.
And these males were constantly on the move.
Oh, wow.
Despite frequent attacks from the dominant males,
Right.
they would display excessive sexual behavior,
Okay.
often directed at inappropriate partners.
Oh, wow.
They were like the embodiment of frenetic energy, unable to find a place within the existing social structure.
It's like they were desperately trying to connect,
Yeah.
to break through the chaos.
Right.
Even if it meant behaving in ways that were totally outside the norm.
A very astute observation.
Thank you.
And it speaks to the overall impact of crowding on social behaviors.
Yeah.
It's not just about space, it's about the breakdown of social cues,
Yeah.
the distortion of natural instincts, and the emergence of these coping mechanisms that in some cases
Right.
were totally pathological.
And then, of course, there were the males that exhibited homosexual or pansexual behavior.
Yeah, these males seem to have lost the ability to distinguish appropriate partners.
Okay.
They would make sexual advances towards males,
Really?
towards pups, even towards females that weren't in heat.
Wow, a clear reminder that crowding can affect not only the quantity of social interactions, but also the quality.
Absolutely.
It's like the rules of the game just get completely warped.
Exactly. And it's important to note that Calhoun's work had a huge cultural impact.
He did.
The term behavioral sync took on a life of its own,
It did.
appearing in literature, film, even comic books as a way to describe the perceived anxieties of urban crowding and social decay.
Yeah, that term really captured the zeitgeist, right?
It did.
It tapped into that fear of what happens when we're just too much together, too
Well.
close for comfort.
Yeah.
But was Calhoun just a pessimist?
Yeah?
Did he think that this was like the inevitable fate of all crowded populations?
Not at all. Calhoun saw the behavioral sink as a warning,
Okay.
not as an inevitable conclusion.
Okay.
He believed in the human capacity for adaptation and innovation.
Okay.
He wasn't arguing that high-density living was inherently bad,
Yeah.
but rather that we needed to find ways to design environments and social structures that could mitigate the negative effects.
So instead of succumbing to the behavioral sink, he was advocating for this more proactive approach,
Right.
like designing our way out of this potential dystopia.
Exactly. He even coined the term conceptual space,
Oh, interesting.
arguing that human ingenuity and technology
Yeah.
could help us overcome these physical limitations. He believed that we could create spaces, technologies, and social structures that would allow us to thrive even in high-density environments.
That's a bit more hopeful.
Yeah,
But this deep dive is just getting started.
right.
In the next part, we'll explore Calhoun's later work,
Yeah.
which really focused on designing those solutions,
So
those
let's-
innovative ways to prevent the harmful effects of crowding. Okay, so picking up our deep dive into the work of John B. Calhoun, we've explored his research on population density, from those kind of disturbing behavioral sink experiments to his more optimistic ideas about how we might design our way out of an overpopulated dystopia.
Yeah, and in this final part, it's worth considering some of the criticisms of Calhoun's work and how his ideas have been interpreted, sometimes in ways he might not have intended.
Right. His work has been incredibly influential, but it's also generated controversy. Like, some people argue that his findings in rodent studies can't be directly applied to humans. After all, we're not rats in a cage, right?
Exactly. We have these complex cultures, technologies, and social structures that rats and mice just don't have.
Right.
But, Calhoun wasn't suggesting an exact one-to-one correspondence.
Right.
He saw his work as more of a cautionary tale, highlighting these potential dangers of overpopulation that we should consider.
Okay, so it's more about understanding those underlying principles,
Right.
like the potential stressors that density can create,
Exactly.
rather than saying, well, if it happens to rats, it'll definitely happen to us.
Right. It's not a doomsday
Mm.
prophecy.
Mm.
It's more like, hey, let's think critically about how we design our cities, our institutions, and our social interactions, especially as populations grow. He was advocating for this proactive approach to urban planning and social engineering that really takes into account the psychological and social needs of individuals.
But some critics have also accused Calhoun of being overly pessimistic, like a doomsayer predicting the inevitable collapse of civilization under the weight of our own numbers. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's an oversimplification. While it's true that Calhoun's early work, it did paint this kind of bleak picture of the potential consequences of unchecked population growth. He wasn't saying that we were doomed. In fact, he was a strong believer in human ingenuity. He believed that we had the capacity to adapt and innovate, to find creative solutions to the challenges of density.
So he was more concerned with complacency
Right.
than inevitability. Like he was trying to shake us out of this idea that we could just keep piling into cities without considering the consequences.
Exactly. He saw his research as a wake-up call, a challenge to find ways to design spaces, technologies, and social structures that foster well-being even in these densely populated environments.
And it wasn't just about physical space. Remember his concept of conceptual space?
Oh, absolutely.
He believed that we could expand our horizons through communication, through education, through the global exchange of ideas.
That's a key point. And Calhoun saw technology as a double-edged sword. It could exacerbate the problems of density, leading to isolation and social fragmentation. Or it could be used to foster connection, collaboration, and a sense of common purpose.
So the message isn't technology is bad.
Right.
It's let's use technology wisely to build a better future, even as our world gets more crowded.
Exactly. And Calhoun's work has resonated with those who are trying to create more human and sustainable urban environments. Architects, urban planners, social scientists, they've drawn inspiration from his ideas, exploring ways to design cities that promote social interaction, community building, and a sense of belonging.
It's interesting how his work, which started with those, somewhat disturbing animal experiments, has had such a lasting impact on the way we think about human societies.
That's the power of a compelling idea.
It is.
Calhoun's research, even with its limitations and controversies, has sparked these important conversations about the relationship between our physical environments, our social structures, and our psychological well-being.
So what can we take away from this deep dive into the work of John B. Calhoun? What's the lasting message for us today?
I think it's a call to action. A call to be mindful of the potential challenges of density, but also to seize the opportunities that it presents for innovation, for collaboration, for social connection. It's about designing our cities, our institutions, and our technologies with human well-being in mind, creating environments that foster a sense of belonging, purpose, and possibility.
And it's about recognizing our own agency, our ability to shape our destiny, both individually and collectively. We're not just passive passengers on this overcrowded planet. We have the power to design a better future, one that embraces both density and humanity.
And on that note, we leave you with this final thought. What kind of world do you want to design? What kind of spaces, technologies, and social structures will allow us not just to survive, but to thrive in an increasingly dense world? These are the questions that John B. Calhoun's legacy continues to challenge us to explore.